Good afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sonja Schmid. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Science, Technology, and Society here at Virginia Tech in Northern Virginia. And I'm excited to welcome you all to CIREN. This is the 28th in a series of seminars, talks, and discussion on nuclear emergency response. The series is part of my NSF Career Award on globalizing nuclear emergency response. And in the spirit of this type of grant, we emphasize the importance of both research and education in the area of nuclear emergency preparedness and response. So all CIREN speakers are meeting with graduate students as part of their engagement. And whenever possible, we plan to provide access to a recording of their lectures. CIREN, the Seminar on Interdisciplinary Research and Education in Nuclear Emergency Response, is generously supported by Virginia Tech's Office of the Vice President for the National Capital Region and Virginia Tech's Policy Strategic Growth Area. Many thanks to the staff of the Virginia Tech Research Center's Executive Briefing Center and the IT team for their support, and also to the students, staff, and faculty in STS for helping to make this happen. This is, I'm afraid, the last scheduled CIREN event. My research project continues, but I won't be hosting any regular meetings anymore. If you are involved in nuclear emergency response and wish to present your work as part of CIREN, or if you have a specific speaker in mind that you'd like to see as part of CIREN, please contact me, as I will consider hosting ad hoc events when possible. We're finalizing our website and will announce its launch to the CIREN listserv. The website will contain recordings of the lectures, slide decks, and speaker bios, and will hopefully become a resource for the community of nuclear emergency response practitioners and for those who study them. So today we're live streaming this talk, and we have over 70 remote participants signed up. These attendees are joining us not only from our main campus in Blacksburg, US universities near and far, federal agencies and national labs, but also from international agencies such as the IAEA and the International Committee of the Red Cross, as well as institutions in France, Britain, and Canada. Welcome. For those of you watching us online, if you would like to submit questions or comments to our speaker, please send an email indicating your name and affiliation to ciren@vt.edu. And I'll read them to our speaker after the talk. But let me introduce our speaker today. Frank Kitching started his career in nuclear emergency preparedness as the Nuclear Safety Officer, NSO, for Canadian Forces Base Halifax. And in that position, Frank developed plans that required to safely host nuclear-powered vessels from the US, the UK, and France. This position requires a master's in nuclear engineering, which Frank obtained from the Royal Military College of Canada in 2004. Since retiring from the Navy in 2008, Frank has participated in the conduct of nuclear emergency preparedness training and exercises in Canada and internationally. While working for International Safety Research, now Calian Nuclear, Frank developed, delivered, and evaluated full-scale exercises in Canada and Romania. Frank was the project manager for Exercise Unified Response, a 3-day exercise at Ontario Power Generation's Darlington's nuclear generating station. XUR, is that how you pronounce it?
XUR, yeah.
XUR involved all levels of government and was a true full-scale exercise. During the planning process for XUR, Frank developed a media simulation tool and an exercise control tool that were necessary to fully engage the exercise participants in the reality of dealing with the situation of that scope. These same tools were used in Romania's full-scale exercise, Valahia 2016. And that was funded by Norway grants and delivered through the Norwegian Radiation Protection Authority. In addition to the media tool, they also used a radiological simulation tool to create the radiation environment for responders on the ground. And this tool provides responders with a radiological reading based on their GPS coordinates and the time within the scenario. I first met Frank and his team at an IAEA conference on nuclear emergency preparedness and response in 2015, and since then he has been a regular remote attendee of CIREN events from the outset. So I'm very pleased to finally welcome him to CIREN. And again, if you're watching us online and have questions, please send them to siren@vt, as in virginiatech.edu, indicating your name and affiliation. And now, please join me in welcoming Frank Kitching.
Thank you very much. So that's me in a nutshell. A little bit of experience here and there, a little bit of experience internationally. But what we're going to talk about today is we're going to start with how to conduct a full-scale national level exercise. And then we're going to get into this realism that we used for exercise unified response. So if I cover topics that you are currently an expert in, I hope you're not too bored that I'm repeating subject matter. But hopefully it'll be interesting and educational for everyone participating. So, nuclear emergency response. These are some of the topics I'm going to cover. A lot of people question whether it's necessary to exercise for nuclear emergency response. A lot of organizations, emergency response organizations, are stood up. So, as I say, this is a unique challenge. Hopefully it's one that will not be faced by anyone in Canada, the US, or worldwide at any time in the near future or ever again. We've seen a couple of responses as required from Chernobyl and from Fukushima. Those were real-world events. And what makes those unique? For most of the public, radiation is an unknown factor. They understand floods. You can see a river rising. They understand forest fires. You can see the smoke from a forest fire. But when you tell the public there's a release of radiation to the environment, it's invisible. They don't know the threat. They're not familiar with the threat. That's hard to communicate to people. There's a substantial fear around radiation. Again, communicating with the public about that is essential. It's difficult to communicate this to the public. How do you make them understand the threat? They're going to assume that any level of radiation is a bad level of radiation, when in fact that's not actually the case. Inexperience. A lot of the first responders, a lot of the emergency managers don't have experience participating in nuclear emergency responses, unlike the annual events like flooding and forest fires. And of course, the last one is trust. The public in this complex situation has to trust the people in the government that are making decisions. And it's necessary to maintain the public's confidence so that the public takes the actions you require them to take for their own protection. So, what are the complexities of a full-scale national level exercise? Well, to start with, there's a continuum of training exercises, and the full-scale one is the last one on that list. If an organization has plans for nuclear emergency response, they should be conducting training. Drills are conducted repeatedly, several times a year at nuclear power plants to make sure that their procedures are in place. So, when I talk about a full-scale nuclear exercise, I'm not focusing on what nuclear power plants do. Nuclear power plants have procedures, they have equipment, they've recently purchased new equipment, emergency mitigating equipment, to make sure nothing happens on the power plant. So when we talk about a national exercise, we're talking about the off-site response. The nuclear power plant is going to do everything it can to cool, control, and contain that reactor. We're talking about those events where every effort has been made to do that, and yet the system still fails. And we have a release into the environment. It's called a severe accident. So something has gone horribly wrong for a long period of time, and every effort of the plant to contain and cool and control the reactor has failed, and it has resulted in a release off-site. And we saw that at Fukushima. the event was so catastrophic that there was nothing that the nuclear power plant could do to prevent a failure of that containment and the eventual release of radiation into the environment. Tabletop exercises are great times to get people together who have a stake in this, but it's a discussion. You script an exercise, you have a discussion, you take the time to answer questions. There's no pressure, there's no requirement for people to make decisions rapidly. So it's a good opportunity to fine-tune your exercise by thoughtful discussion using a scripted scenario. Command post exercises ideally are for senior management, people who are decision makers, but you want to hold an exercise specifically for them without involving hundreds or thousands of people in the field in order for them to do an exercise. So you can have a command post exercise that's a little bit more demanding. The injects require decisions to be made in a timely manner before the next event happens and the exercise starts to cascade out of control. And then full-scale exercises obviously are maximum number of participants. Anyone with a stake in nuclear emergency response is invited to participate in the exercise. We call it boots on the ground exercises. You have field teams out in the environment taking measurements. You have hospitals being deployed. Truly from the boots on the ground where they're getting radiological readings from the environment all the way up to the federal level or the national level government. When people are being evacuated, resources are being brought in to help assist the nuclear power plant in containing that nuclear emergency. That's the power of a full-scale exercise, is the sheer scale and the number of people involved in it. So some of the participants here, public safety, health, environment, public works, first responders, public affairs, legal, military. In Romania, it's the military that actually goes out into the environment during a release and will take radiation readings on the ground so that they can know where to evacuate and where it's safe to remain. All of this information leads to recommendations on sheltering or evacuations, etc. So those are some of the areas, and we're going to talk a little bit about, I just want to show you the scale of this nuclear emergency response. Exercise Unified Response, a direct result of Fukushima and direction from the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission that the power utilities with nuclear power plants had to do exercises of this scale to prove that not only the utility was capable of responding to a nuclear emergency, but that the region and the province and the federal government all had the capability to respond to this type of event. So I'll just show you the list of participants. 15 organizations, 15 departments within the federal government participated in XUR. 10 ministries within the province, and all of these ministries and all of those departments you saw all have a role in nuclear emergency response. It could be from healthcare, what do you do with people who think they've been contaminated, Ministry of Natural Resources, where's the contamination gone, municipal affairs and housing, how do we find lodgings for 10 or 15 100,000 people who have been evacuated from around a nuclear power plant. Within the region, 20 organizations, including school boards, took place in unified response. There are a significant number of civilians living within a 20-kilometer radius of the Darlington nuclear power plant. And a lot of services will be impacted. How do you move people from old age homes, get city buses, et cetera, et cetera. So that's so the city is obviously very interested in those topics. We also had cities of Peterborough, Toronto, and Pickering participating in this exercise. Those are host cities, so when an emergency happens and people are evacuated, they stand up organizations, including the Red Cross. They send people to reception centers. If they think they're contaminated, they can be checked, et cetera, and then lodging is found for them if possible. So really, truly large exercises. So a little bit about the design process. So you can imagine you don't throw together one of these exercises in a couple of weeks. With that number of participating organizations, this takes planning. This takes a year to 18 months to do a full-scale national exercise at this level. You need to set up some teams to help organize that. Your exercise design team and your technical scenario team are both interested in the scenario that is going to unfold. Now, these nuclear emergency response exercises at this scale typically are 2 to 3 days in length and could stretch to 12 hours a day. Typically, we've been running them 8 hours a day for 2 or 3 days in a row. And various phases of the nuclear emergency are enacted or scripted for that play. Day one is typically response at the nuclear power plant where they exercise their emergency mitigating equipment, etc. So the exercise design team and the technical scenario team. The technical scenario team is looking at how to break the reactor. How do we create a scenario that can eventually result in a release to the environment? What do we have to do to that reactor? How many things have to fail? How many safety systems have to fail? So we want a technical scenario on site that is relatively realistic if all of the worst things happen, which they tend to do in our exercises. The exercise design team is then looking at how do you take that technical scenario, what's going wrong with our plant, and we create the off-site consequences. What's the impact once the release happens? And you saw the list of organizations. Are there injuries? Are there people contaminated? Are there road accidents? Are there blockages on the road, the preferred evacuation route? So you create those scenarios, and that has to stretch over 3 days. The communications team talks about the exercise from a promotion of that exercise. Most of these organizations, these utilities are spending a lot of money to run these exercises, and they want the public to know that they're happening, that they're taking nuclear emergency response seriously, and that they're actually doing something to prepare and demonstrate that their team is ready and capable. And finally, we've got the steering committee team. That's a very senior level team that doesn't get too involved in the scenario itself. The steering committee team is vital because it's senior management within the critical organizations that are participating in your nuclear emergency response. The last thing you want is a department head of the province or the state or the federal government to say, what, there's an exercise tomorrow, no one told me about that, I don't want to participate because XYZ. People get very nervous when you tell them that their plans are going to be tested. So the role of the steering committee is to brief up, to let the senior managers know that an exercise is happening, that their department is committed to participating. Bad things happen when key organizations stop participating or have to withdraw from an exercise. You don't want to find yourself in that situation. Conferences and workshop. Because this is such an ongoing, long process, we hold 3 conferences and at least 3 workshops to bring everyone up to speed on what's going on. The first conference is about getting people invited to participate in the exercise and getting them excited about testing their plans and procedures. Conference number 2 is about the objectives of those organizations. We want to confirm, you saw there's about 45 different organizations participating in this exercise. Each one of them has their own objectives. So conference number 2, you talk about the objectives and you deconflict objectives. Let's say the police want an accident on a roadway at 8 o'clock at night, but no one else is participating at 8 o'clock at night. You have to deconflict and make sure that everyone gets what they want out of the exercise to the maximum possible. And then the third conference is about, that's a conference with the trusted agents. You go over the scenario, you make sure that all of those objectives are achieved. Workshops, we do a command and control workshop. It's quite interesting that because ministries work within a silo of their responsibilities, they don't necessarily understand the responsibilities and the roles that are going to be done by other organizations. So command and control workshop allows everyone to see what everyone does so that John Smith knows who to call to get this type of action accomplished. Who's responsible for that? What ministry? Another workshop is scientific information. So there is information about the plant parameters, what's going on site, details about potential releases, details about the source term, et cetera, et cetera. Those have to be shared. Those have to be shared to a limited audience. But who do you share that information with? Who gets that information? Who gets to decide how to look at that? That's also vital. And the final workshop we conducted in Unified Response was a communications workshop. Who does public affairs? Each of these departments have their own public affairs organizations that represent the interests of those departments to the media. But when an emergency happens, at some point in time, there has to be a central organization that talks and coordinates all of the messaging that's going out so that the messaging that's going out to the public is accurate, it's timely, and it doesn't contradict something that someone else is coming out. So as soon as you have an emergency situation, typically there's a single organization that will stand up and take responsibility for that. As I mentioned, it's vital to get the objectives of each organization. And that's a huge process because, as I say, we have to, A, understand what they need the scenario to do. We have to script the injects so that the scenario provides those opportunities to achieve those objectives. The last thing we want is an organization to participate in an exercise and at the end of the exercise say, I didn't achieve any of my objectives. I didn't get any checks in the box. I needed to test X, Y, and Z, and you didn't provide me with a scenario that did that. So with 45 organizations, you can see that that's a long process, and that's why we have some of those workshops and just to make sure we've achieved that. There's a bunch of documentation required, so we capture the scope of play of the organizations, we capture their objectives, and we capture their constraints in the SOC document. Scope, objectives, and constraints. So after talking with all of these organizations, we document all of their objectives, all the scope of play. My organization can only play on day 1 and day 3, and my constraint is that I can only play from noon to 1600 on day 1 and day 3. So we've got to work around that. We can't put an inject in the morning if the organization isn't there to respond to the inject. So again, we're juggling a lot of information to make sure that the participants in this exercise, the participants who have taken the time to help develop this and are going to commit 2 or 3 days to this exercise are actually getting what they need out of it. There's other documents. There's a controller manual, an evaluation manual. There's an actor's guide if you have actors who are playing injured individuals in a car accident or someone who's coming off of the plant who's been injured in their efforts to return the reactor to a safe condition. Those people all get scripts. They get, a card that tells them they're missing a finger or they had a heart attack or et cetera, et cetera. And then there's if you have engaged a video company in capturing some of this exercise play, you'll give them a script for where to go, what to shoot, et cetera, et cetera. Then you've got to establish your control and evaluation organizations. Every site that has an emergency operations center, every site that has a police officer checking, putting up a roadblock or assisting in an evacuation should have a controller with them so that they can be observed. And if any injects are going into that location, the controller steps in and he'll give that information to the participants. He steps back and they act on that information. That individual, based on a lack of depth in a lot of organizations, controllers are typically also evaluators. So we have to provide the evaluators with a process to capture the lessons learned and the details about the response that we want to upon. I'll follow up to make sure that those issues that were identified are actually been rectified, and they're given a timeline. It could be a few months if it's a simple issue, or a few years if it requires something more significant. So as I'm So that was unfortunate. But I don't know when to stop transmitting. I think he was probably watching online, so hopefully it was quick. Potential issues. Again, it's important for senior staff to be aware of the requirement to participate. We do not want a department or a key participating organization to withdraw at the last minute due to a senior staff member who wasn't informed of the exercise. Organizations tend to focus on their comfort zones. If you do certain procedures, if you are used to responding to traffic accidents, you may not want to respond to a traffic accident that also involves a contaminated car or contaminated individuals inside. We really try and push organizations to push the boundaries of what their plans do and detail. This one happened, the third bullet, the real world events. Anytime you hold an exercise, there's the chance that something in the real world is going to interfere with that exercise. We held Exercise Unified Response in May. The province had to direct a lot of its resources to evacuating Indigenous peoples from flood areas in Northern Ontario. They didn't have the manpower to do the exercise and the real world response simultaneously. So they provided a few people who could answer the phones and provide, and basically they simulated themselves and their full response with just a few people. They were allowed to participate and continue to participate because their participation was critical to all of the other organizations participating. A no-duff situation, that's when a real accident happens. Again, maybe there's a police officer directing traffic at a stop location and an actual car accident happens, or something is being unsafely done. We call a no-duff. This is a real event. Someone was actually pinned between two cars, therefore we're going to call a no-duff. We're going to call in an ambulance. We're going to stop play at that location. Of course, this is all relayed through the controller to the lead controller, and who will make a decision on what's going to happen. Real media could potentially take an interest and may interfere with the play of the exercise if they think there's a story there. But when the organizations are open about the fact that they're conducting an exercise, media really tends to be positive on these events. Second last bullet, exercise used as a training opportunity. We saw the process of going through trainings, through drills, through tabletops, through command post exercises. Those are all training opportunities. That's where you can take the time to stop the process, stop the scenario, ask the questions, make sure what you're doing is in line with what your plans are saying, or if your plans don't work, figure out what will work. This is not a training opportunity. This is an opportunity. Your plans are effective. So what that means is people who are used to training environments will turn to a controller and say, well, what should I do now? And the controller says, refer to your plans. I'm not here. You have to pretend that I'm not here. You are responding to a real event. And I'm not going to be here. I'm going to be at home sleeping because I've got the next watch. So you have to respond as if this is real. Don't wake me up. So there is a tendency to see these as training opportunities. And players can become disengaged or uninterested. So if you haven't got a realistic environment, if the organization that's participating isn't doing enough or is not seeing this exercise as challenging enough, they may become disinterested. So most of that was about the planning process. Once we conduct the exercise, we need a strong lead controller. The lead controller is the individual who is responsible for ensuring every inject and every objective of all of those participating organizations are met across this 2-day process. He's going to be the one who answers the questions, do we stop play for this real event? Do we postpone it? Do we shift the entire exercise into our rainy day dates, et cetera, et cetera. Now, he's in close contact with the leads from the nuclear power plant, and that decision will be made. But he is situated in the simulation cell, and he is watching every inject go in that is critical to this exercise. Again, we have controllers in key locations. They're maintaining situational awareness through a website, through push-to-talk radios and cell phones with the lead controller. So if an issue arises in the location where they have control responsibilities, they will reach back to the lead controller and try and sort that out. Evaluators. There's a lot of ways to evaluate exercises. There's a lot of ways to evaluate drills. What we do is we remove the stress from the evaluator by giving him a simple instruction. You observe what is happening in your location, you write down the time, and you write down the observation. So the evaluator is not there to give an opinion about someone's performance. He's not saying Charlie didn't know his job. He's saying at 12:35, Charlie didn't answer the phone. At 12:37, caller called back. Charlie was disengaged, et cetera, et cetera. The reason we're taking observations, factual observations, is we need to be able to substantiate our findings at the end of the process. And we use key injects to trigger dependent injects. So the first inject might be station alert. And we'll have a whole bunch of injects that go on after that key inject is committed to the timeline. I'll show you a tool that we use for that. So no news articles will go out about a station alert prior to that key event being entered into the timeline. No news articles about a release to the environment will go out to the participants before the release to the environment happens. So you have to identify key instances, key injects that everything is hinging upon. And then you create child injects to that, so that that parent inject is your starting point, the child injects follow on. The first inject, the key inject, is usually scripted, but again, it could be delayed because of real-world events, a no-duff situation. So as I said, the evaluation process, you gather the time and the observations. So when the evaluators come to the evaluation meeting a few days later, they're coming with a scrapbook full of notes and factual information about what they observed. During the planning process, we have developed evaluation criteria against which the plans and procedures are going to be evaluated. Those criteria include things like public communications, protection of the public, protection of emergency workers, et cetera, et cetera. So there's about 17 criteria against which the response is evaluated. Again, this is a long process. This is a 2-day process, usually full 8 hours a day, because we're trying to find opportunities for improvement and we're trying to find gaps. So what's an opportunity for improvement? An opportunity for improvement is where a plan exists to address the issue that was brought up in the scenario, but there was a deficit in that plan. It didn't go according to script, or the plan is out of date, or the phone number that's in the plan is 15 years old, and when they called that phone number, it had been disconnected. That's an opportunity for improvement. Update your phone list regularly. Gaps are a situation was presented in the scenario for which no plan exists. That is a gap. So we've seen examples of gaps, and they're much less. There's fewer gaps. We find fewer gaps than we do opportunities for improvement. And then once we've identified an opportunity for improvement or a gap, we justify that. We use the factual information that was recorded by the evaluators to say, this is why we found this gap, point 1, point 2, point 3, point 4, point 5. So that no one can come back to us and say, well, that's just your opinion. No, it's not our opinion. These are the factual bases under which we've made this finding. It's very easy to defend that way, and then people can say, okay, that gap exists, they've substantiated that gap, I have to fill that gap. Post evaluation process, we're going to make a plan to evaluate that, or to rectify that. Flexibility in findings. So sometimes a plan doesn't exist, or a plan isn't quite right, but the individual who's acting during that play actually has a good idea. It's not written down, but he enacts something that actually works really well. You've got to capture those, because sure as heck, a week later he's going to forget that he did that, and it's going to disappear into the ether, and that great lesson learned is going to be lost until the next time an exercise happens, or, God forbid, a real event happens, and that gentleman's not there to have that great idea again. So we have to acknowledge in our evaluation process what works and what doesn't work. And I see I'm rapidly running out of time, and I'm only partway through my slides. So, why realism? You're going to hear this very quickly now. So the experience establishes a knowledge base. People who participate in these exercises come away knowing more than when they went in. It builds confidence. This is a unique situation. If the first time a mayor or a governor sees a nuclear emergency response is when a nuclear emergency response is happening, he's going to be stressed. If he has seen one in an exercise, at least he has some understanding of what's going on. That experience maximizes your operational efficiency, and it minimizes the stress of the people participating. They'll have some confidence. I know what I'm doing. I know who to talk to get information that I need to make decisions. It allows people to understand crisis communications. What is the public expecting? What do I need to tell people so that they feel safe, so that they understand the situation? It allows people to understand crisis decision making. You cannot have an effective response to any emergency where people disappear into a conference room for 6 hours while they discuss things while the emergency is unfolding just outside that conference room. You have to understand crisis decision making. You have to find ways of trusting the people you're working with and maintaining the trust of the public. Paralysis by analysis. Has anyone heard of that phrase before? I have participated in exercises with very smart people, very technically competent people who just want to wait for a little bit more information. I won't make a decision now because if I could just get a little bit more information. We did an exercise in Canada with a CBRNE response team, and they sent a health physicist into a radiological environment. It was a fast forensics exercise where there was information on a bus that had blown up. The team had to get in, take that information off the bus, and find a second potential explosive device. The explosive device had a radiological component. We used real radiological sources in the exercise. The health physicist went in, saw his meters go up, and it took him forever as he tried to map the radiological field. Meanwhile, his team, who understood the objectives of the fast forensics, let's get in, let's find the information we need to because there's another bomb. His team was waiting for him to map the radiation field so that they didn't exceed a dose. The people behind him knew what to do. That was not the right spot for the health physicist. He should not have been in the field, and he delayed the response to the point where the second device actually detonated. Battle rhythm. Your organization should understand the battle rhythm. I kept a little dancing guy. It was an icon recommended by. So the battle rhythm is, again, that briefing process. What's happening? I'm the senior leader. I'm the on-scene commander. What's happening? What do you need immediate help with? What actions are you taking? I don't need a 20-minute explanation. I need brief points so that we can, as we go around the room and I get more information, we can enact some safety protocols. And it builds confidence again. The last thing is, if you can create a realistic exercise that puts people in the environment they're going to be in a real situation, it's going to be the first time they've experienced that. For most people didn't participate in Fukushima or Chernobyl. It's going to increase their stress level. They're going to be stressed out. You're going to hit them with so much information and the requirement to make decisions quickly and effectively that their stress level is going to go up. That kicks in survival instincts. That kicks in stress. When your body is stressed, in a stressful situation, you remember things. I can remember almost having a car accident 15 years ago, and I can tell you for a good chunk of 1 minute exactly what actions I took to avoid that car accident. I can't tell you what happened 5 minutes after that or an hour before that, but I remember that 1 minute where I was almost in a car accident. I can tell you exactly what happened. If we can recreate that, stress, the value of that training goes up, and people will remember that exercise, will remember what happened, and that's what you want. So, how do we achieve realism? We can simulate the pressures that are going to be put on an organization from the media. Nuclear emergency response, those phones are ringing off the hook. Every reporter in a truck, in a cable news van is showing up at your doorstep. They're all looking for the scoop. You're going to be totally inundated. The public is going to call. The public is going to say, I was just evacuated. I have 40 head of cattle on my property. What's going to happen to them? I own a small business in downtown Darlington. I'm bankrupt in a week if I don't get back there. You can put that pressure on the appropriate organizations to make sure they have responses to that. And you can simulate the radioactive release. So you've got all of these boots on the ground, you've got all of these field units participating. You can provide them information so that when they go out into the field, they actually have something to send back to their lab. We can simulate the media through news, print articles, social media, Twitter clones, Facebook clones, and we can phone and email people in the decision-making chain of command. We can talk about health effects. I'm pregnant. What does this release mean to my unborn child? Evacuated citizens, evacuation routes plugged, not taking the proper route, business owners, food and water, pet safety. People love their pets. They're going to leave work and go back and get their dog, even if it means going back into a radiation environment. Closed highways, property values, contaminations. These are all things that the public or businesses can bring up during the exercise. So the exercise includes things like, I'm just going to quickly show you a few seconds of So this is a news report on day 3.
Good afternoon, I'm Sylvain Landry and this is ISR News at noon. We have good news and bad news concerning the dark Darlington Nuclear Generating Station. Power has been restored and operations are improving, but there was radiation released into the atmosphere overnight. Officials reported that last night, pressure in the damaged reactor's containment unit shot up dangerously high.
So that's an example of a news video that we produced for Exercise Unified Response. And we put those videos on a news website, which is also not on. Well, which does things like a typical news website would do. It gives you the weather, it gives you some articles. These are pre-scripted and they've been in there for a while. If I follow this link here, I didn't put the image on the main page. You can see that a reporter has been invited to view the emergency mitigating equipment that was just purchased by the Non-Such nuclear power plant, and he's on site on the morning to get a tour when things start to go wrong. He is chatting about his visit to the plant. So again, all of these things can be pre-scripted. We can do 1,000 chats, blast them into an organization. They trend. They do everything that Twitter does. We also have a Facebook clone. But organizations should be practicing this. They should be paying attention to this. Things will trend on Twitter that the CNSC or the province or the region or the nuclear power plant wants to address, because this is how the public now communicates quickly about these types of events. We can simulate that, and we can simulate the public's response to that. And we allow, of course, the CNSC to have an account so that they can post information. Please follow this link to this website where you will find out about decontamination if you've been evacuated, how to decontaminate your pet, where to go to if you've been evacuated, what reception centers are open for you, et cetera, et cetera. So all of the response you would expect can be simulated here. That is the news website, and unfortunately I don't have a lot of time to talk about that further. We also have it's here. The ability to simulate, where's my mouse? The radiological environment. So this is the Non-Such site down here. They've had a release, and it's blowing towards us here currently. And we've dropped some drop boxes into the environment. There's a drop box on this peninsula, and you can see the green dots are radiation arriving at those drop boxes. So we can simulate the response to a release to the environment. So these are just gamma monitors. They're looking for what's going on. If I look at this specific point, I can see a trend. My release has started at approximately 10 o'clock, and the release is passing over that monitor. We also have a tool that is working on my smartphone right now. And it is simulating the reading right here at this location and this time. So what this is meant to do is simulate a dosimeter. So if you've got people working in the field, they're wearing dosimeters, they're moving in and out of the plume, they may be tracking the plume to get a realistic radiological picture. They will see a dose rate and a dose as would be provided by a dosimeter that they might be wearing. This is paired with a dosimeter. It's a Bluetooth dosimeter, and that provides realism for the exercise participants in the field. If you're a police officer standing at a checkpoint and you've been issued a dosimeter, and all of a sudden the dosimeter goes into alarm, you have to know what to do. Or if your dose approaches the dose limit that you have been sent out into the field with, you have to be able to look at your dosimeter and say, actually, I'm approaching my dose limit. I've been here for 8 hours. I think it's time they put someone new on this post. And that's the type of realism that is effective in allowing people to understand their role in a nuclear emergency response. We provided this type of tool to the Defense Ministry in Romania, and the guys were amazed that they could drive their airtight HEPA filter vehicle, their military vehicle meant for CBRN response in a wartime environment. They could drive it into this simulated plume and actually see that they were in a contaminated environment. If they got out of the vehicle, they were in a contaminated environment. That allowed them to find the center line of the plume, find where the contamination was the highest. That information is fed back to an operations center, and you can confirm that the places you evacuated are actually the right places, that places that may not have been evacuated don't need to be evacuated, or yes, in fact, the levels in that spot are evacuated. A release from a nuclear power plant is not going to be a nice little cone that blows downwind in a straight. It's going to follow valleys, it's going to follow hills, it's going to follow temperature inclines. So you've got to send those teams out to find where the radiation ended up and to make those recommendations for either protecting the public by sheltering them or evacuating them. So going back to the slide presentation, let's see if I can do that. This tool that we use for the radiological simulation has to be capable of all releases. So if an organization uses a plume model pre-release, we have to be able to reflect that on our tool. We have to be able to model the release. We have to be able to put in meteorological conditions. This is quite a bone of contention for our participating organizations. Which way is the wind blowing? I don't want the wind to blow over my city. Let's blow it over your city so that I have less concerns about this issue. Sheltering and evacuation. We have to be able to provide readings in the field so that these recommendations can be made. You saw some of the symbols that are associated with those readings. One at the bottom right near the power plant was a circle with a red top and a yellow bottom. Basically, the red top says you've reached your level for sheltering. The yellow bottom says 75% of your level for evacuation. So the symbology you use and the way you communicate and make recommendations to civilian authorities is important. Because if you say to the governor of the state that we've reached 37 millirem per hour outside of City Hall, he's going to say, what? That's useless to me. But if you say we've reached 50% of our evacuation level outside of City Hall, he understands 50%. He doesn't understand 37 millirem. So recommendations to offsite authorities can be practiced using this, and it helps with decision making. He's going to get a recommendation from you. We've reached 100% of our evacuation level in this community. We recommend evacuating. He's going to say, fine, I understand that recommendation, but we're in the middle of a snowstorm. If we evacuate right now, people are going to die in the highways. That's his job. His job is to take all of the information available to him, think about it, and either and act on your recommendation or say, I understand what you're saying. We'll keep the people sheltered in their homes. This snowstorm is more worrisome right now. That's what we can simulate through these environments. You saw that I had created the Non-Section Nuclear Power Plant. It's directly south of Washington. It started its release at 10 o'clock, and the wind was directly from the south, so it's blowing up in this direction. And when it arrives here, all of those drop boxes that I've put in place will start to record the readings. So, when a full-scale nuclear emergency exercise works, the players are engaged and they're acting to address the emergency as if they feel it is real. They won't be bored. You're putting them in a stressful situation and you're demanding action of them. You are demanding that they make decisions as they would be in a real event. We want to minimize controller involvement. Controllers should be invisible. And when you have a full-scale nuclear exercise with the list of participants that we saw earlier, we don't have to simulate those now. Every time you have a participating organization or an organization that's not participating but are critical to the response, you have to simulate them. That draws away from the realism of the exercise when they're not calling the people that they would normally call for an emergency. So when you have this full-scale exercise, the actual burden on the simulation, except for the news website and the chatter, is actually dropped because people will call the people they should call in an emergency and get the answer.
Yeah, got muted.
I guess my hand waving that's my responsibility. Sorry about that. So, when you have proven plans, they allow for flexibility. They allow for an understanding of organizational responsibilities, who to reach out to as this event unfolds. They're scalable. You know, we just saw the fire in Paris. That is a scalable plan. One fire truck arrived at the cathedral, and they said, we're going to need a lot more guys. There was 100 firefighters plus, and they scaled that operation up to try and save that building. Similar things, similar capabilities. If you know that there are experts in neighboring states that can come in and assist you. This is going to be a labor-intensive environment that's going to go on for months, and you are going to exhaust the experts you have in your state pretty quickly. Hopefully you can call on neighboring states with expertise to assist with that. It allows for rapid database decision-making. Database decision-making, and it's sort of touches on the last point, safety case demonstration. When you make decisions based on radiological readings in the field, those are defensive. Those are defensible. You have to weigh the benefit of an evacuation against the cost of an evacuation. Quoting from one of your own EPA documents, there was Hurricane Rita in 2005. 103 or 108 people died as a result of the evacuation order. 2/3 of those people did not have to evacuate. So the consequences of the decisions can be tested in this type of an exercise. Make sure that you are evacuating when you need to evacuate and not putting people at risk when they don't have to be at risk. That's the minimize the risk to the public bullet and maintain public confidence. If you can demonstrate in an exercise that you can maintain public confidence, you're constantly in front of the media briefing the public on what's going on the recommendations that are being made, on the information you're receiving to make your decision making. The media is not going to drift off and find an expert in California who's going to tell you to run for the hills. If you can build the confidence with the media and the public and maintain that throughout the process, that's going to be an effective emergency response. So we need long lead times. I touched on some of these already. Steering committee is vital. If we get senior managers pulling out at the last minute, that's not good for a full-scale exercise. Controller training is tricky. A lot of the controllers you will work with haven't done an exercise at this level and may not be aware of how important their content and their injects in. Planning conferences and workshops are vital. The evaluation process, it's also complicated. Like I say, it's a 2-day process, but you have to have a good evaluation manual. You have to train your participants and your sim cell, and you have to acknowledge that realism adds value, that it brings something to the table that only enhances the exercise. So the question I had when I read what the acronym SIREN stands for, Education in Nuclear Emergency Response. How many have you done? 50? 28. And so that's part of the education process. Putting these on a website and allowing people to view these at any point in time and learn lessons from France, from other international speakers, and from around the U.S. That's important. There are some skills that can be learned. There are some skills that can be trained in nuclear emergency response. I've discussed some of those, the decision-making process, how to make fact-based decisions on evacuation, et cetera, et cetera. Those can all be trained. We've done that training in the past. Is there an appetite for that training? Well, we'll find out. That's it. That's the presentation. If you have any questions that aren't addressed today, I know we'll open the floor to questions. My email is there, as is my phone number. I will not hesitate to respond to any emails or any questions that you may have. Thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, so I'll pass around the microphone for questions or comments for Frank, but I also wanted to encourage our online participants, if you have questions for the speaker, please send us an email, siren@vt.edu. All right, any questions? Well, then I'll start. I was really struck by your repeated emphasis of the senior staff being reluctant for their organizations to participate and pulling out at the last moment, etc. Why is that? Can you elaborate on that?
It is very tough for people to admit that their plans aren't perfect. And when you put the plans to the type of test, a full-scale exercise, you will find issues. It doesn't matter how long people have worked on the plans, there will always be something that is brought to the fore by doing this process. That's not a bad thing, because the iterative process of exercise, revision, training the new plans only strengthens the plan in the long run. But there is a certain amount of reluctance for people to demonstrate that their plans aren't 100% efficient. So the CNSC, by requiring these exercises, are aware that improvements are always possible. And we could do this 20 times with a specific organization, and I guarantee we'll find something on that 20th iteration. The limitation of a full-scale exercise is we can't bring to bear the full pressure that the province or the federal government would face in that situation. We tend to focus on a few things because, let's say it's a medical response. We'll focus on that and the healthcare system and decontamination. But we're leaving out agriculture, we're leaving out the environment, because we have limited resources every time we do one of these exercises, and we have to carefully vet the objectives of those organizations so that we can achieve everything within a sandbox. But there's a big playground out there that we can never simulate to the extent that a real event would simulate. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks. Any questions from the room? Yes, go ahead.
Sorry. Mitchell Chung from the U.S. government. I have a question about, for the United States, given that most responses for CBRN-related incidents are going to start at the state, county, and municipal level, whereas in most other countries it's already done at the national level. How do you recommend we approach for the United States towards this type of response as well as planning exercises?
Yeah, and you've had some real incidents within your borders. You know, you've had anthrax threats, you've had things that you have responded to. You can always further the training. When we did the CBRNE exercise in Ottawa, the FBI CBRNE team was there and participated, as well as the RCMP from Canada, CBRN teams from the UK and from Australia. So they do a joint exercise once every few years. The situation with a CBRNE event is slightly different in the fact that there's potentially a limited footprint. A chemical event will have an impact within a few miles if it's a really bad one, especially if it's an attack. They might have limited quantities of material that they're trying to disperse in the environment. Biological event, obviously, if it's a delayed incubation, people will travel, and that's an entirely different scenario. An RN event where an RDD, a radiological dispersal device, is detonated in a city, usually that's a denial weapon, right? They want to close down Wall Street, they want to close down important infrastructure by the threat of having this radiation present. You can still do those exercises. You can still simulate those responses. Where available, you can use real radiological sources, but you can also simulate biological sources. You can simulate chemical sources that will actually activate the detectors you would use in the field. From there, the authority to evacuate a larger radius from that initial event probably lies with the mayor of the city, and it may never escalate to the state level. Because the mayor has that authority. Now, if that event continues to escalate and the city starts to run out of resources, then they'll look to the state for assistance. If it continues to escalate, then they'll look to the federal government for assistance. Does that sound reasonable? Yeah?
Makes sense. I was curious, given that we're learning this from obviously a Canadian perspective whereas in the United States, this is everything starts locally.
Right. So there was an escalation in an exercise unified response. The federal government plays a role in assisting the province. So the province actually has to ask the federal government for assistance. When the province runs out of beds to put up in gymnasiums to house the people who are displaced, when the province runs out of police officers to maintain the cordon around an evacuated area so there aren't looters moving into people's homes, then they'll go to the federal government and maybe ask for assistance from the military. That has happened in floods, that has happened in many situations in Canada. So I don't want to leave you with the impression that the federal government automatically gets involved. It is an escalation process that may take hours or it may take days or weeks based on what's happening in the real environment.
Okay, I have a battery of online questions here, so maybe I'll start with those, and then I'll return to the room. So first of all, Taylor Loy, who is a graduate student in the Department of Science, Technology, and Society at Virginia Tech in Blacksburg, has some questions about this radiological simulation tool. What tools, models, and data were used to validate the fidelity of the simulated radiological readings? What assumptions were built into the simulation regarding containment, integrity, and wind conditions? These are all kind of dependent questions. Is the radiological simulation tool configurable or hard-coded for drill-specific conditions? And did the GPS constraints have out-of-bounds feedback that defaulted to nominal background radiation? Feel free to answer any or all.
That's an entire 40-minute discussion. So the radiological simulation tool is not meant to be an accurate modeling of a potential release. Now, we can do 1,000 things with this tool. We can change the source term, we can change the release fraction, we can change the wind direction, we can have various phases. We can model it on release categories that are predefined for nuclear reactors in Canada or the US. We can do an RDD, we can do a submarine, we can do an aircraft carrier. Basically, we put a source term down, we give it an epicenter, and we can model everything that goes on with that. We can even model the capabilities of the detectors that are picking up the radiation so that if a detector goes into an alarm at a certain level, we can simulate that. So the simulation tool that we're using is a training tool. We are not trying, with this exercise tool, to replace CalPUF or any other modeling tool that is used by an emergency operations center to model the plume based on current conditions. It's a tool to generate a downwind field containing radiological contamination. We can have a complete mix of the contaminants. We can change the source term, but it's a Gaussian distribution. It goes right down the center line, equal distribution on either side of that. The only thing we can do is change. And the reason we're not interested in simulating a real release is there are plenty of tools out there to do that. This is an educational tool. It's not meant to accurately reflect exactly what's going to happen in a nuclear emergency. It's meant for educational purposes.
Great, thanks. Okay, Next question from an online participant, Georges Vaissier, who was also a Siren speaker in the past, and a consultant to the IAEA on severe accident management guidelines. He asks, how many people in the whole exercise need specific training? Do they have in their function description a specific reference to such radiological exercise? And if I may add to that question, I was interested in, you mentioned the public multiple times in your presentation. How much does the public participate, and if so, how do you train the public to be involved in this exercise?
I'll answer your question first, and then I'll ask you to repeat the previous question. So the public is not typically involved in an exercise unless they have a role, obviously, in one of those organizations. We have engaged the public in unified response and a few other exercises as far as providing feedback on the media releases by the participating organizations. So a lot of these organizations will provide media releases, obviously CNSC, the Emergency Operations Centre for the Province of Ontario, Government Operations Centre in Ottawa. They may be releasing press releases. We ask a focus group of the public, usually the residents within near proximity to the power plant that's being exercised, to look at that information and say, is this clear? Does this alleviate your fears? Do you need more? Do you need less? Is it too complicated? Is it too technical? And so they'll look at that information and provide us feedback on how all of these organizations are supplying that information to the public so that they can improve that process. We did do a news conference, a live news conference during Exercise Unified Response, where they brought out an engineer to talk to the press, and he was very technical. He was too technical to be of use to the public. And so that's a guy working in his comfort zone. These are the things I really know about, so I'm going to talk about these. He never expressed concern about the impact on the public. He never sympathized or empathized with the plight that they were currently in. All of these things are important to gain the public's support and understanding, and to alleviate the panic within. You have to give that impression that you know what you're doing and you're under control. And the previous question was?
How many people in the exercise need specific training, and how do you, I guess, add that or express that in their job description, that they need to be trained for exercises like that?
Well, these plans exist within these organizations, right? The Provincial Nuclear Emergency Response Plan is a plan that resides within the Government of Ontario, and there are people responsible. The organization is the Ontario Fire Marshal and Emergency Management Organization. So they publish that, they revise it. They've revised it since Exercise Unified Response. So they should be making that available to their staff and training their staff on that process. When we were hired for Unified Response, we didn't do most of those things. We didn't do the drills, and we didn't do the training. We allowed those organizations to do that. Then the controllers and the evaluators, and they are all briefed typically days before the event, or before the exercise, so that it's fresh in their mind. They understand the scenario, they understand their responsibilities, and they're ready to go a day or two before. And that is a large organization. We can have 40, 50 controllers, and if the personnel are available, we can have that many evaluators as well. And during that evaluation process, we get all those back together for 2 days.
And where would the I forgot what you call it, the lead controller, what's typically his or her background in terms of training?
They will have done these large-scale exercises. It is a skill set that you can train and you can achieve. And you start with smaller tabletop discussions, and you move into up the ladder, for lack of a better term. And it is a skill set. They have to balance everything that is going on. They have to understand the complete scenario and the impact of a potential issue on one site on the overall exercise process. Can I localize this? Can I cut their play out? Are they vital to the exercise? If they're vital to the exercise but they have to withdraw, can I simulate them? That's all of the decision making by the senior controller.
Great. Okay. Another question from Charles Dussel, who is a human factor researcher in France, in Paris. He asks, do you also work on return of experience, lessons learned in nuclear emergency response between countries, but also between nuclear power plants, exercises, national and local level, etc.?
That's not something we have branched into yet, but I can tell you that the utilities, Bruce Power, Ontario Power Generation, New Brunswick Power, they are quite proud of the fact that they're doing these exercises. These are large scale, they're really revealing their weaknesses, and they're willing to learn, and they have the right attitude in the approach to these exercises. We're going to put our plans to the test, we're going to find some faults with it, we're going to improve. When they go to these organizations, they go to meetings at the IAEA. The province of Ontario has been there, province of New Brunswick has been there. And they're quite willing to talk about their experiences and the lessons learned from these processes. Occasionally, we will invite international observers to come in and see this entire process and the evaluation process, because the evaluation process is vital to making those findings, and it's a painful process. There's a lot of back and forth, a lot of discussions to make sure that the finding we make is justifiable. The last thing we want is someone to dismiss our report because it's factually inaccurate. And again, that's a bit of a skill set to pull that information out of your evaluators and to make sure they've collected the right information so that you can have an accurate report.
Okay, on to the next online question. This is from Maël Gomri, who is from the University of Paris Descartes. Do you associate social scientists with your reflections and analyses of exercises, evaluations, and what could social science bring to your analysis?
That's a very good question. Not specifically. We have human factors organizations that work with us in evaluations, not on this particular one. There are experts within the province, within the region in social sciences, and sometimes they are in the audience. They are either in the participating audience or they're one of our controllers and one of our evaluators. We don't ignore it. But it hasn't been something we've necessarily incorporated to date, probably to the extent that we could. Honest answer.
Any other questions in the room? Okay, I'll move on to one more question, again from Georges Vasier. Authority. This is about your confidence level on the map that you showed us. Authorities do not only wish to know what the present threat level is, say 50% of evacuation, but also what development can be expected. How may we go up to 100% of evacuation, and when? And to what confidence level then can you talk about these? How do you extrapolate potential future releases?
Right, so there's an entire organization at the nuclear power plant specifically there to communicate with offsite authorities, right? So things like plant conditions, temperatures, pressures, whether cooling systems are working, whether emergency cooling systems are working, all of these things are communicated to offsite authorities, usually through an offsite interface organization which has the technical expertise to say, we know our containment building is supposed to hold up for 24 hours, but the pressures and temperatures are increasing more rapidly than that. We project a release from that containment building within 16 hours. And then they communicate that off-site, and now there's a little bit more urgency in getting that evacuation zone cleared before that release happens. So most of that information, most of that forecast is going to come from the plant conditions. And the ability for the nuclear power plant to interface and pass that information on to the state or the federal government. In some cases, the state will have an expert who can absorb that information and understand the implications of that, and sometimes that has to come from the experts from the nuclear power plant. So the state in that case might be looking for expertise or recommendations from the plant because they may not have an in-house expert who can filter this data and turn that into future possibilities. But once a release occurs, the release I had scripted for this was a ramp. It just got worse and worse and worse on a level ramp. And so if you have detector networks that are close to your power plant, most power plants have a ring of detector networks or detectors, you can see the situation getting worse. You can see the readings going up. And therefore, if it's not in agreement with your model, you can refine your model, or you use real readings in the field to make the recommendations for evacuation and sheltering. The risk with a model is there's quite large error bars on almost every model that's out there. There's a lot of assumptions in models. When you have real data, it's more defensible to use real radiological data to project. Even if I've got something a mile away, I can be fairly certain based on wind distributions what I'm going to see 10 miles away or 20 miles away. And then you take actions based on that real world data.
Great.
Make sense?
Any other questions from the room? Okay, I'll ask one from of my list of questions, and then I'll return to the online questions. Could you say a little bit more about the uniqueness of the nuclear response challenge that you kind of briefly touched upon in the beginning? You said responders are inexperienced. It's unlike forest fires, unlike flooding that we handle on a fairly regular basis still. How do you, on the one hand, capitalize on the experience of responding to emergencies, to other kinds of emergencies, while at the same time addressing this unique, invisible, untouchable, etc. Challenge of a radioactive release?
Right. So when a organization is stood up, say it's the province of Ontario, and it's the provincial emergency response organization within Ontario, and they're standing up for a flood, they know that they've got to talk to environment, they know they've got to talk to transportation, they know they've got to find logistics, and they do it almost every year. So they've refined that process. There's going to be new people come into that organization. There's going to be a continual turnover. So a bit of that will be relearning the same lessons. Same thing with forest fires. There's a limited number of organizations that have to get involved. The situation with radiation, the most critical situation is that the public are frightened of it. They understand the flood. They can see the flood. They understand the forest fire. They can see the smoke from the forest fire. They know that if they don't evacuate from the area of the forest fire, that the fire is going to potentially damage the cottage they're living in. It's not as clear for a radiological response. And what's even less clear is why someone who's getting a dose of radiation may not be evacuated. They're going to assume, the public is going to assume, that any radiation is bad radiation. But there's a balancing act between the dose that is potentially received by a member of the public and the risk of the evacuation itself. If they're going to get a dose of radiation that's the same as a flight to Europe, do they really need to evacuate their home? There's other consequences. There's economic consequences. If you evacuated an area of, say, 50 miles around Washington, that impacts agriculture, and no one will ever buy the products from that zone ever again in the future, right? Maybe years and years down the road. But if you extend your evacuation zone too far, you're impacting those businesses. People won't want to live there. Property values go down. Businesses go bankrupt. If you only needed to evacuate 5 miles, then you've made a mistake. You've made an economic mistake that will impact people's lives forever. So there's a balancing act between what's the real risk Am I increasing the cancer risk for someone 30 years from now as it's increased on a flight to Europe, as pilots are exposed every time they go on a flight? We monitor pilot doses because they receive more than the general public. So we track that. We track radiation technicians. We track anyone who works in the nuclear industry or is exposed to medical isotopes or industrial isotopes. There's dosimetry programs for that. And it's understood by those people. It's communicating clearly that the dose that you may be receiving on the very periphery of this event is not going to impact you adversely. That's a tough message. And you will get people who self-evacuate. They just won't listen to, however good your argument is, they're going to leave. And those will be people out to 50, 60, 100 miles. And of course, they're going to want to be assured that they weren't contaminated during release.
Thanks. You actually answered the other question. Okay, well, if there are no more questions, please join me in thanking our speaker for an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks. I'm here. Thanks, Sonia.